The lights flickered once, then twice. It wasn't unusual for them to behave erratically during storms, but there was something different about this moment. The storm outside had picked up speed, the wind howling against the windows of Emma's high-rise apartment. The faint hum of the lights, barely noticeable on a normal day, seemed amplified now, unnaturally loud in the eerie silence of the room. She sat on the couch, staring at her phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media, when the sudden flicker of the lights caught her attention. The room plunged into darkness just seconds later, the hum of the lights now gone, replaced by the soft whistling of the wind outside. "Great," Emma muttered, standing up and moving toward the kitchen. The storm had knocked out the power, something that happened from time to time during severe weather. She opened the kitchen drawer, fishing around for a flashlight. The cold air from outside crept in through the cracked window, raising goosebumps on her arms. She pulled the flashlight from the drawer and flicked the switch. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating her dimly lit apartment. She moved quickly, knowing it would take a few minutes for the building's generator to kick in and restore power. But something about the absence of light made the apartment feel more oppressive. The storm continued to batter the building, but now Emma was aware of something more, an odd stillness that had settled over the space. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it felt as though the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The noise from the storm outside faded into the background, and she stood still for a moment, listening to the unnatural silence that enveloped her. Suddenly, a soft, muffled thud echoed from down the hallway. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as she strained her ears, she could hear it more clearly. It wasn't the usual creaks and groans of an old building during a storm. This sound was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like footsteps, but softer, quieter. Emma froze, the flashlight beam shaking slightly in her grip. Another thud, this time closer. Her pulse quickened. Was someone else in the building? She strained to hear more, but all she could hear was the storm outside, the wind pressing against the windows, and that odd, rhythmic thudding from somewhere in the darkness. She stepped cautiously toward the hallway, her flashlight illuminating the long corridor. It was empty. She glanced down toward the end of the hallway, where the shadows seemed to press in, deeper and darker than they should have been. The faint thudding sound continued, but now it sounded off. It wasn't coming from the floor. It was as though it was coming from the walls themselves. "It's just the storm," she told herself. "You're imagining things." But something in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. She took a deep breath and walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing louder than she expected in the silence. She reached the utility closet where the fuse box was and checked to see if it had tripped. The flashlight beam danced across the metal panel, but everything appeared normal. That was when she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just out of the corner of her eye, a figure stood motionless, its back turned to her. Tall and unnaturally thin, it looked like a person, but there was something wrong with the way it stood. Its arms hung too long, too still, and its head was slightly tilted as if listening for something. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Emma's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. She blinked, and when her eyes refocused, the figure was gone. Her breath caught in her throat as her hand instinctively reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled, and she nearly dropped the flashlight as she turned to run back to her apartment. But the hallway was no longer as she remembered it. The shadows had lengthened, stretching unnaturally long, and the air felt heavy, as if the very walls were closing in on her. A deep chill spread across her skin, and she quickly turned back toward the safety of her apartment, every fiber of her being urging her to get inside. The apartment door was locked. Of course it was. but when she fumbled with her keys, her hands felt clumsy, almost too numb to function. The silence outside was deafening, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She needed to get inside. She needed to be somewhere safe. When she finally stepped over the threshold, the feeling of safety didn't come. The apartment, even in the dark, felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, and she realized that the sense of dread hadn't left her. It had followed her inside. Her breath came quicker now as she looked around, eyes scanning the darkened corners. The whispers began. At first, they were barely audible, like a soft murmur behind her ear, but as she turned, the noise grew louder. Her heart raced and she froze. The whispers weren't coming from anywhere in particular. They were everywhere, pressing in from the walls, the floors, the ceiling. The whispers were inside her head. She turned toward the door, her pulse pounding in her throat. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, flickering in and out of existence. She stumbled back as the temperature dropped, her breath now visible in the freezing air. "Who's there?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure why. There was no one there, no one who could answer. She heard the whispers again. They were clearer now. "You're not alone." She spun around, the flashlight beam catching on something in the corner. The shadows shifted, and Emma could just make out the shape of a figure standing there, its face obscured by darkness. And then the lights came back on. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. The apartment was just as it had been before the power went out. No figure in the corner, no chilling whispers in the air, but the feeling in her chest remained, heavy and suffocating. There was something wrong in this building. Something was waiting. The lights flickered back to life, and the hum of electricity filled the air. Emma stood frozen, her breath shallow, eyes darting around the apartment as if expecting something, someone, to emerge from the shadows. The room looked the same as it had before, but nothing felt normal. The feeling of being watched hadn't left her. It lingered, crawling under her skin, pricking every nerve. She took a few tentative steps into the living room, glancing back toward the hallway. The faint thudding from earlier had stopped, but the eerie silence was now deafening. She shook her head, trying to push the panic away. It was just the storm, just the power outage. But deep down, she knew it was something else. Something darker. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. She pulled it out, hands trembling, and saw that it was a message from her neighbor, Sam, who lived a few floors above her. "Hey, Emma. You okay down there?" Emma's fingers hovered over the screen. She quickly typed a response. "Yeah, just the storm. Everything's fine." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "What about you?" The reply came quickly. "Same here. Just wanted to check. I heard something weird earlier. Thought I saw something moving in the hallway." Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she read the message. Sam had heard something too. She wasn't the only one. Her thoughts raced, and her stomach twisted with unease. There was something in the building. Something alive, but not quite human. "Yeah, I saw something too," Emma typed, her fingers shaking as she sent the message. Sam's reply came almost immediately. "What did you see?" Emma stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how to explain it. What could she say? She didn't even fully understand it herself. The figure, the whispering, the way the apartment felt wrong. How could she put that into words? How could she make someone else understand that something was stalking her, something that shouldn't be there? Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Loud, deliberate steps, slow, as though someone was walking toward her apartment. Emma's blood ran cold. She turned her head toward the hallway, her pulse pounding in her ears. The door to her apartment was still locked. No one had entered, but the footsteps, they were real. They were getting closer. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside her door. The silence that followed was suffocating. The whispers had returned, but now they were louder. They seemed to be coming from inside her head again, swirling, spinning around her mind, their words indistinguishable. She slowly moved toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The footsteps had stopped, but the air had grown thick with an almost tangible presence. The darkness that filled the hallway pressed against the door, as if waiting for her to open it. With a deep breath, she turned the knob. The door creaked open, but the hallway beyond was empty. The lights above flickered once more, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The air felt cold, colder than before, and Emma stepped into the hallway, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. No response. The building was silent again. The storm outside raged on, but within the walls of the high-rise, it was unnervingly quiet. She looked down the hallway toward the elevator, then to the stairwell door at the end. Everything seemed still. Emma took a cautious step forward, her heart racing as the shadows seemed to shift around her, moving unnaturally. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing just behind her, but the hallway was empty. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. "Just check the hallway, make sure nothing's there," she told herself, trying to steady her nerves. The thudding from earlier returned, but now it was louder, closer. Her eyes darted toward the sound, and she saw movement from the corner of her eye. A shadow, a figure, just a glimpse, and then it was gone. Her breath hitched. No, 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 no. She turned, her footsteps frantic as she rushed back toward her apartment, almost stumbling over her own feet in her haste. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it quickly. Her body was shaking, her mind reeling, but she couldn't make sense of what was happening. The whispers had stopped. The footsteps were gone. For a moment, she thought it might all be over. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her breathing, but the sense of dread never left. It lingered in the corners of her mind, in the shadows of the room. Then there was a knock at the door. A soft, slow knock. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't frantic. It was deliberate, almost mocking in its slowness. Emma's body went rigid. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but she couldn't move. She couldn't do anything but stare at the door, waiting for the next knock, waiting for whatever it was to come inside. The knock came again, this time louder. She flinched, her breath caught in her throat. She reached for her phone once more, but as her hand touched the screen, the lights went out again. The darkness descended, thick and impenetrable. The whispers returned. "You're not alone, Emma." Her body trembled with fear as the whisper seemed to come from every direction at once. The flashlight was useless now. She couldn't see. She couldn't breathe. The apartment felt smaller, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on her. She heard the faintest shuffle of movement from behind her, the soft rustle of something brushing against the floor. And then she felt it, a cold breath on the back of her neck. The cold breath against her neck sent a shock of terror straight through Emma's spine. Her whole body went stiff, and she held her breath, not daring to move. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of her phone, but it wasn't enough. The darkness pressed in, thick and oppressive, as though it had mass, as though it were alive. She slowly, carefully, turned her head, her heart hammering in her chest. The flashlight was still in her hand, but it was useless in the deep blackness. She felt the weight of the air around her, and the suffocating silence seemed to be squeezing the life out of her. Nothing. No one. The apartment was empty. Maybe I imagined it, she thought, her breathing shallow and rapid. But even as she told herself that, she knew it wasn't true. She could feel it. Something was here with her. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You're not alone." The voice was different this time, colder, deeper, almost like a growl. Emma shivered, her eyes darting around, searching the darkness for some sign, some movement, something, anything, that would prove she wasn't losing her mind. She backed up toward the corner of the living room, clutching her phone and flashlight, her whole body trembling. Her mind raced. What was going on? Was she losing her grip on reality? Or was there really something in her apartment? The knocking returned. Soft, but steady like a countdown. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the door. The front door. It was too slow, too deliberate. And then, almost as if the door itself were responding to the sound, the door handle rattled. The sharp, metallic jangle sliced through the silence, and Emma's heart jumped into her throat. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, but it felt like it was no longer hers to control. Something had a hold on it. Something was playing with it. The handle shook again. Then, just as suddenly as the rattling had begun, the door fell silent. Emma stood frozen. Her hands, slick with sweat, gripped her phone tightly, her flashlight still flickering weakly in the dark. Her breath came in shallow bursts, the room suddenly too small, too heavy. She dared not approach the door. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she heard a scraping noise, faint at first, but getting closer. It was coming from the floor behind her, no, from the walls. The walls seemed to hum with tension, as though they were vibrating with the energy of something that shouldn't be there. Her eyes darted from one dark corner to another, but she saw nothing. She could hear her own heartbeat racing in her chest, so loud that it drowned out the whispers. It's just the storm, she thought desperately. Just the storm. But even as she clung to that thought, she couldn't deny the creeping, crawling sensation that slithered up her spine. The feeling that she wasn't alone, that whatever it was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then the doorbell rang. Once, twice, 3 times. It wasn't normal. The building's intercom system was broken, but someone was outside her door, and the doorbell was working. The sound was so sharp, so clear, it felt like it was cutting through her very soul. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. Then there was a shift in the air, a pulse like a wave of pressure that made her ears pop. And she heard it, a voice, low, gravelly, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakable. "Let me in." Emma's blood ran cold. The voice was muffled, distant, but it felt like it was inside her head. She could hear it echoing in the walls, vibrating through the very air around her. It's here. She could feel it now, its presence undeniable. The air seemed to grow thicker, the whispers around her now like a chorus of faint voices. She turned, every fiber of her being telling her to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment was closing in on her. Without warning, the apartment lights flickered back on, bright and blinding. Emma blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to adjust. The sudden rush of light almost made her dizzy, but as her eyes focused, she realized that something had changed. The apartment was still the same, but the shadows were wrong. They stretched longer, darker, as though they had taken on a life of their own. The air was still cold, unnaturally so, and the hum of the lights above felt oppressive, almost as though they were pulsing with a hidden power. She looked toward the hallway, and there it was again. That shape, that figure, the tall, shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the hallway, where the light from her apartment couldn't reach. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Emma stood rooted to the spot, staring at it. Her breath caught in her throat, and she couldn't tear her eyes away. It was watching her, waiting. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, now clearer, more distinct. The words crawled through her mind, each syllable like a burning brand, searing her thoughts. Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice barely a breath, trembling with fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, the lights went out again. Darkness. Silence. Only the faint hum of the air around her, and the pulse of someone, lurking just beyond her vision. A thud echoed through the apartment. Then another, louder this time, and then a scream. But it wasn't hers. It was coming from the hallway. The scream echoed down the hallway, sharp and piercing. Emma's heart raced, her blood running cold as she instinctively stepped back toward the center of the room. The air had turned still, thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. It was the scream of someone in pure terror, but it didn't sound human. It was almost distorted, the kind of sound that makes your skin crawl, as if something's terribly wrong, something unnatural, was happening just beyond her door. Her fingers gripped her phone tighter, the flashlight flickering weakly, its light casting long, jittery shadows across the apartment. Her pulse was pounding in her ears, louder than the scream, louder than the silence that followed it. And then there was nothing. The scream stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The only sound left in the apartment was the soft hum of the electrical appliances, the faint noise of the refrigerator running, the distant whir of the fan. But the silence felt hollow, like a void that threatened to swallow everything around her. Emma's breathing grew shallow. She stood in the middle of her apartment, her body frozen, her eyes wide, darting between the door and the dark hallway beyond. There was something out there, something that wasn't supposed to be in this world, something that had broken through the thin veil of reality. She stepped forward, hesitating at the door. The hallway was still empty, but the air, so cold, so heavy, seemed to be alive, swirling around her, pressing in on her chest. She felt the walls closing in, the space getting smaller, as though the entire building was trying to smother her. Her thoughts raced. Is someone out there? What happened to that scream? Is someone hurt? She had to check. She couldn't stay in her apartment any longer. Not with the feeling that whatever had made that scream was now moving closer, stalking the halls of her building, waiting for her to make a mistake. Emma slowly reached for the door handle. Her hand trembled as she twisted it. The door clicked open with a soft creak. The hallway outside was dark. The same oppressive shadows clung to the corners, but it felt different now. The silence was thicker, like the air had become solid, the walls pressing in from all sides. Her flashlight shone weakly ahead, the beam cutting through the darkness like a thin thread. She took a step out into the hallway, then another. Each footstep felt like it took more effort than the last. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to lock herself inside and never leave. But she had to know what had happened, what was out there. She reached the edge of the hallway, where the light from her apartment no longer reached. The darkness stretched before her, a vast, suffocating nothingness. She felt like she was walking into the belly of some vast beast, its insides dark and unknowable. A rustling sound broke the silence, faint but unmistakable. Something was moving. Emma turned sharply, shining her flashlight in that direction, but the light revealed nothing. Just shadows, she told herself. It's just the shadows. The air grew colder, the chill sinking deeper into her bones. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the steam of it forming little clouds in the air. She turned back toward her apartment, but the hallway stretched on farther than it had seemed before, as if it had grown longer in the dark. Something's wrong. The thought was sharp, urgent, but there was no time to dwell on it. Another rustle. Closer this time. Emma whipped around, but once again the flashlight revealed nothing. Her heart was in her throat now, her hands shaking so violently she could hardly hold the beam steady. Her mind raced with thoughts of the creature, whatever it was, that had caused the scream. What had it done? Who was it? What did it want? Then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. It was hard to make out any details in the dim light, but she could see enough, just enough, to know that it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, too thin, stretched like sinewy shadows. Its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, the face hidden in the dark, but Emma felt its eyes on her. It's looking at me, she thought, her breath catching in her throat. It knows I'm here. A cold, sickening wave of dread washed over her, and she instinctively took a step back, but her foot caught on something, a small object on the floor, and she stumbled. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground and extinguishing with a soft click. The darkness swallowed her whole. For a moment, Emma froze. The silence was deafening, and she could feel the thing that wasn't supposed to be here, moving closer. She knew it was coming for her. She could hear it now, the soft sound of something dragging across the floor, slow, deliberate. It was too close. With a gasp, Emma bolted. She sprinted down the hallway, her feet slapping against the cold, hard floor. She heard the sound of it following her. It was following her, its long, unnatural limbs making the floorboards creak and groan as it moved closer. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. But the sounds grew louder, the steps quickening, the breathless, ragged whispers in the dark. "Let me in." The words came again, this time in a low, guttural growl that reverberated in her chest. It wasn't just in her head anymore. It was real. The thing was right behind her. It was chasing her. Emma rounded the corner and spotted the stairwell door. It was open just a crack, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing just inside. Another shadow, another presence waiting for her. Her pulse roared in her ears. She didn't care. She had to get out of there. She had to escape. With one last burst of energy, she pushed the door open and dashed down the stairs, her breath ragged and her legs burning. The building felt endless, the stairs stretching out in front of her like an infinite tunnel of shadow. The whispers grew louder as she descended. "Let me in! Let me in!" She didn't stop. The ground floor came into view, the light from the emergency exit sign barely visible through the darkened stairwell. The whispers stopped. The air grew still. Emma stumbled forward, her heart pounding in her throat. She reached for the door to the outside, her fingers brushing the cold metal handle, and stopped. Her hand hovered just inches from the door handle, a cold shiver running up her spine. The silence that surrounded her was suddenly deafening, as if the entire world had gone mute. The whispers, the dragging footsteps, the dreadful presence, everything had vanished in an instant. For a brief, surreal moment, Emma wondered if it had all been in her head. Maybe it was the fear, the darkness, the pressure of the building closing in on her. Maybe she was imagining everything. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to escape while she still could. But the door in front of her felt strangely wrong. The emergency exit sign flickered weakly above, casting pale light on the cracked and worn door. Emma reached out again, her fingers trembling as they made contact with the cold metal. Click! The door opened slowly, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The outside world should have been waiting on the other side, but instead, she was met with nothing. Darkness. A thick, impenetrable blackness that reached beyond the doorframe, a shadow stretching endlessly into oblivion. She hesitated, looking behind her, up the stairs, down the hall. The building was unnervingly silent. No footsteps, no sounds, no movement. It was as though time had stopped altogether. And yet, the air felt heavy, heavier than before. A scraping sound, distant but unmistakable, broke through the silence. Something was moving in the dark. Something was waiting for her just beyond the door. Emma's mind raced. It's not over yet. Without thinking, she slammed the door shut. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and the building groaned as if it were alive, the walls contracting around her. She gasped for breath, her heart thudding wildly in her chest. She had to find a way out, but the question gnawed at her. Where? She turned and stumbled down the hallway, desperate now, every step feeling like a laborious task. Her phone, once her only source of light, had died long ago. The darkness felt suffocating, like it was closing in on her from all sides. Her mind was a blur. She needed to get out of the building. She needed to escape whatever was hunting her. But nothing made sense. Where was everyone? Why was the building so eerily empty? The lobby door at the far end of the hall loomed, but it seemed miles away. The shadows around her shifted, forming shapes in the dark. Figures that were watching her. She wasn't alone. Emma's breath quickened, her body trembling as she approached the door. She could see it now, just ahead, the glass doors to the lobby, the faint outline of the outside world. But there was something wrong. Something about the way the light flickered beyond them. The closer she got, the more oppressive the air felt, like the building itself was trying to pull her back inside. The whispers returned, softer now, but unmistakable. Let me in. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request. It was an order. She froze, her blood turning cold. The door to the lobby seemed impossibly far away now, the hallway stretching longer, bending unnaturally. Something was off. Emma backed away from the door. She couldn't go back in there. Not with that thing hunting her. Not with whatever it was closing in. She turned to run, her feet moving faster than they ever had before. Every instinct told her to move, to keep moving. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drumbeat. She didn't look back, but the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps followed her, growing closer with every step. Her feet pounded the floor, and she ran faster, harder, until she collided with the corner of the building's hallway. Her shoulder scraped against the wall, but she didn't stop. The apartment doors around her seemed to blur as she ran. The air felt thick, suffocating, each breath harder to take. She could feel it now, its presence. The thing was right behind her. She could feel the cold touch of its breath on her neck. And then, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment, the lights in the hallway flickered back on. For a brief, blinding second, Emma thought she saw it, the thing that had been following her. Tall, skeletal, with limbs too long and a face that wasn't quite human. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, dark like a shadow, as if they were made from the very darkness surrounding her. She froze for a split second, but that was all it needed. The thing reached out, its fingers stretching impossibly long, wrapping around her wrist with a bone-crushing grip. Emma screamed, the sound echoing off the walls as she struggled to break free. But the more she pulled, the tighter its grip became. The hallway stretched farther, and the walls seemed to close in. She could feel the thing's presence, its cold, suffocating energy wrapping around her, tightening with each passing second. It pulled her toward the darkness, dragging her toward the very heart of the building, toward whatever nightmare waited for her. And as Emma's scream faded into the silence of the building, the darkness closed in. It swallowed her whole. The lights flickered one last time before the building fell into total darkness again. The silence was deafening. In the pitch-black darkness, the sounds of the building seemed to fade away entirely. Emma's scream, the dragging footsteps, everything gone, swallowed by the void. It was as though time itself had paused. Then, the faintest whisper began, like the rustling of paper, but so soft it was barely perceptible. A voice, no, not a voice. It was something deeper, primal, an unnerving sound that made her skin crawl. Let me in. Emma's mind struggled to make sense of it, but her body wasn't hers anymore. It felt as though her consciousness was detached, floating somewhere above her physical form, watching in horror as the events unfolded. Her body was no longer responding to her commands. The grip on her wrist tightened as if invisible hands were weaving through the fabric of the dark, drawing her into its depths. She tried to scream again, but no sound came out. Her mouth moved, but her throat refused to cooperate, constricted by something far more terrifying than fear. Her limbs felt heavy, and her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. Panic surged through her as she struggled to make sense of the shadows closing in, the coldness pressing against her skin. She felt something moving, something brushing against her, its cold fingers dragging over her skin. It wasn't like a touch. It was a violation, an invasion. She couldn't move. She was paralyzed. The grip on her wrist finally released, and Emma collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. She couldn't see, but the weight in the air, the oppressive, suffocating darkness, was palpable. It pressed against her chest, crushed her ribs, made every breath feel like it was her last. Then she heard it, the sound of something, someone, moving through the dark. It was heavy, dragging, deliberate, slow. The thing was here. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she scrambled to her feet, using the walls for support. She could hear it now, breathing, just behind her, close enough that she could almost feel the hot, fetid air on her neck. It wasn't human. The sound was wrong, distorted, like a sick parody of a breath. She had to get out of here. She couldn't stay in the dark. Her eyes desperately searched the blackness, the walls fading in and out of view. She couldn't make out any details, just the faint, glowing red of an emergency exit sign somewhere in the distance, almost mocking her, promising safety, but seeming unreachable. Emma moved toward it, step by agonizing step, trying to ignore the terrifying sensation that the thing was watching her, waiting for her to falter. Suddenly, the sound of breathing stopped. The silence was oppressive once more. Emma's pulse quickened. What was it waiting for? I need to get to the door. I need to escape. She hurried toward the light, her hands outstretched, searching for anything to guide her. She could feel the walls shifting, as though they were warping around her, as though the very building was alive. And then, a cold hand clamped down on her shoulder. Emma gasped and spun around, her breath caught in her throat. But there was nothing there. No creature, no figure, just the shadows, and the sound, the whisper, "Let me in." This time, the voice was louder. It was clearer, more commanding. Her mind felt like it was being pulled apart at the seams, as if the very essence of her being was being unraveled, shredded by the force of whatever presence now occupied the building. The darkness seemed to grow. It was alive, stretching, expanding, hungry. It was everywhere. In that moment, Emma understood. It wasn't just hunting her. It was consuming her. Slowly, methodically, piece by piece. She took a step backward, her eyes wild, searching the empty hallway, but it was pointless. She couldn't see anything, could hardly feel the floor beneath her. Everything was shifting, warping, twisting into something unrecognizable. The darkness was everywhere now, suffocating her, pressing on her chest, clawing at her soul. It was here, and there was no escape. The lights flickered once more, the brief flash of illumination revealing nothing but blackness. A sound echoed through the hallway, a voice guttural and unrecognizable. "You can't run. Not from me." The words felt like ice, like they had been carved into her very bones. Emma's body went stiff. Her head ached, a sharp, violent pressure building behind her eyes. She stumbled backward, and suddenly, there was nothing but the black void in front of her. It consumed everything, her thoughts, her vision, her hope. And then, nothing. The sound of dragging footsteps, the feeling of being pursued, of being watched, faded. The weight of the air lifted. The suffocating blackness retreated. Emma blinked, her surroundings blurring into focus. She was back in her apartment. The one she had thought was gone, lost to the darkness. But now it was eerily calm. The lights flickered overhead, casting a soft, almost comforting glow. Her pulse slowed. She looked around, her breath trembling in her chest. Had it all been a dream? Had she imagined it? Had the terror in the building been nothing more than her mind playing tricks on her? She felt a soft, distant hum, the hum of the refrigerator, the whirring of a fan, the familiar sounds of an ordinary day. But then she saw it, the blood-stained handprint on the wall, a dark smear, freshly painted in red. Emma's heart stuttered, and she spun toward the door. She had to leave, had to get out of there. The whispers began again. "Let me in." This time, they weren't just in her head. They were real, and they were coming for her. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Emma's heart raced as the voice called to her, pulling her attention like an invisible string. She backed away from the blood-stained handprint, her legs shaking beneath her as her mind struggled to make sense of the situation. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on her with an increasing weight. She couldn't breathe. The familiar hum of the apartment was no comfort. It only felt like a lie, a mockery of normalcy. "Let me in." The words felt different this time, more insistent, more alive. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking uncontrollably as she tried to turn it on. The screen remained blank. Dead. Her breath hitched in her throat. The power must have been cut. But why? The lights flickered again, this time longer, leaving the room in a disorienting half-darkness. She was sure she hadn't imagined the footsteps she'd heard earlier, or the cold hand on her shoulder. Something was here. The sound of dragging, slow, deliberate, echoed down the hallway, but she couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It was closer than it had ever been before. The air felt thick, charged with an ominous presence. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. But everything was wrong. The room felt wrong. The smell in the air, stale, metallic, like rust, was wrong. And the whispers, they had grown louder, as though they were coming from just behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. She had to get out. She had to escape. She didn't know what was chasing her, or who, or what it was, but she knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just in her head. The door was cold beneath her fingers, but as she tried to turn the knob, it wouldn't budge. It felt as though something was holding it shut, an invisible force pushing back against her. She yanked at it, frantic, her breath coming in short gasps. The whispers grew louder. "Let me in. Let me in." Her hands were slick with sweat, her pulse racing in her chest. She pulled harder at the door, ignoring the way her vision blurred and her body trembled with exhaustion. She had to escape. She had to survive. The darkness thickened, coiling around her like a living thing, seeping into the cracks in the walls, into the very air she breathed. The temperature dropped sharply, the chill seeping into her skin, into her bones. She pulled again at the door, and finally, with a sharp, violent click, it swung open. But what awaited her on the other side wasn't the hallway she knew. It was a twisted, distorted version of it, like the apartment building had shifted, warped, into something else entirely. The walls were cracked and broken, the floors warped and buckling. The lights that should have been overhead were replaced with flickering red bulbs, casting everything in a sickly glow. The air was thick with the smell of decay and dampness. And there, in the middle of the hallway, was a figure. It was tall, hunched over, its long limbs twisted in unnatural angles. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a grotesque blur of dark shadows, too indistinct to make out, but its eyes glowed red, piercing through the darkness, fixed solely on her. Emma's blood ran cold. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Let me in," the voice whispered directly in her ear, and she felt its icy breath on her neck, sending a shudder through her entire body. She stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror, her hands pressed against the wall for balance. The figure didn't move, but she could feel it, hear its breathing, low and ragged, like something dying but unwilling to let go. In that moment, Emma knew she had to run. There was no more hesitation, no more time for second thoughts. She turned and bolted down the hallway, her feet barely touching the floor as she raced toward the stairwell, toward the only escape she had left. She could hear it behind her, that thing, its footsteps dragging, echoing through the dark. It was gaining on her, getting closer. The chill in the air seemed to freeze her in place as she sprinted, adrenaline pumping through her veins. With every step she took, the building around her seemed to close in, as if the walls themselves were alive, constricting, squeezing her tighter. She didn't know where she was anymore. The hallway stretched out in impossible directions, twisting and warping as though reality itself had been shattered. She reached the stairs, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. She wasn't going to make it. She wasn't going to make it. And then the figure was there, right behind her. Its skeletal hand shot out, gripping her shoulder, the coldness of its fingers like ice against her skin. She screamed, jerking forward, but it was too strong. It pulled her back, its grip tightening with every passing second. She struggled, fighting with everything she had, but it was no use. The darkness was swallowing her whole. And then, just as she was about to give in, just as the last shred of her strength began to fade, the lights flickered again. For a split second, the hallway illuminated. And in that moment, Emma saw the truth. The figure wasn't alone. There were more of them. Dozens. Hundreds. Shapeless forms, their eyes glowing red, their movements slow and deliberate. They were everywhere, closing in around her, surrounding her, trapping her in their suffocating grip. The world went black again, and the whispers came flooding back, louder now, filling her mind with their maddening chorus. "Let me in." And Emma understood. She wasn't going to escape. She wasn't going to survive. The building had already taken her. The darkness pressed in tighter, suffocating, consuming. Emma's body felt weightless, like it was being pulled from within, her limbs suspended in the void as though the world around her no longer existed. The cold, ghostly whispers gnawed at her sanity, each one a razor-sharp sting against her mind. The thing that had been chasing her, it wasn't just one entity. It was an army, a horde, a collective of souls that had been absorbed into the very fabric of the building, woven into the walls, the floors, and the shadows. "Let me in." The voice slithered through her ears, each syllable sinking into her skin like a venomous bite. She felt the invisible fingers gripping her, pulling her apart from the inside. The air grew colder, and then the temperature dropped even further, until her breath hung in front of her in thin clouds of ice. Emma wanted to scream, wanted to fight back, but her body refused to move. She was trapped, caught between the ever-encroaching darkness and the terrible figures that had surrounded her. Their glowing red eyes seemed to pierce through her soul, their forms blurring and distorting as if they were mere projections, flickering between life and death. And then she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. A low, guttural rumble, like the building itself was groaning in agony. The walls around her trembled, the floor beneath her shifting. The whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. And then the voice spoke again, louder this time, clearer. It echoed through the hollow corridors of her mind, as though it was coming from deep within the very heart of the building. "Let me in or die." The threat sent a surge of terror through Emma's chest, but before she could process it, a cold hand, a claw sharp and rigid, pressed against her cheek. The contact sent a wave of agony through her body, as though it was draining the warmth from her very bones. Her vision blurred, and the edges of her consciousness began to darken. She was losing herself to it, losing her grip on reality. "No, no, I won't." But the words caught in her throat. The very air seemed to choke her. She struggled to breathe, to move, but it was like trying to escape from the grip of a nightmare. Her mind was slipping, drowning in the shadows that threatened to engulf her. Suddenly, a violent burst of light exploded in front of her, blinding her for a split second. She squinted, her vision swimming, trying to make sense of the impossible sight before her. The figures that had been surrounding her now seemed to fade, their forms dissolving into the light. She could hear a faint voice, someone calling her name. "Emma!" It was faint, distant, but real. It was a sound that didn't belong in this place. A sound of hope, of life, pulling her back from the brink. The darkness didn't want to let her go, but the light, it felt warm, comforting. It felt like a lifeline. Her limbs finally responded. She felt the strength returning, her fingers twitching, her arms slowly raising as though her body was waking up from a deep, paralyzing slumber. The shadows that had been holding her seemed to recoil, pushed back by the light. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled forward. She reached out, her hand trembling, and the light seemed to guide her, pulling her through the blackened, twisted hallway. The whispers grew fainter, the oppressive weight of the darkness easing. "Emma!" Her name, clearer now, louder. And then she saw it, a figure, standing in the middle of the hallway, bathed in light. It was her neighbor, the one she had seen earlier in the building, before everything had descended into chaos. "Emma!" The figure called again, its voice warm, familiar. She blinked, unsure if she was still dreaming, or if this was some cruel illusion. But the light felt real. The warmth was real. "You're not alone," the figure said, its voice strong, reassuring. "But you have to hurry." Without thinking, Emma ran toward the figure, her feet moving as though they had a will of their own. She had to escape. She had to get out. She couldn't stay in this place any longer. The building had already taken so much from her. The figure reached out to her, its hand outstretched. And for a moment, everything seemed to pause, like the world was holding its breath. And then, the floor beneath Emma's feet gave way. She fell, plummeting through the darkness, her scream lost in the void. The walls shifted again, twisting, distorting, and the light flickered, blinding her as the world spun around her. "Let me in." The whisper grew louder, surrounding her. But this time, Emma wasn't sure where she was anymore. Was she still in the building? Was she somewhere else entirely? Her body hit the ground with a sickening thud. She gasped for air, blinking in confusion as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. She was no longer in the hallway. The floor beneath her was cold, hard, and unfamiliar. She scrambled to her feet, panic rising in her chest as she looked around. The world around her had changed again. The walls were now covered in peeling wallpaper, the air thick with dust. The hallway stretched out before her, but there was no sign of the figure, no sign of the light. She was alone. The whispers began again, but this time they were different. They weren't just haunting her mind, they were echoing from every corner of the room. "You can't escape." The walls seemed to close in, pushing her backward, toward a door she hadn't seen before. She didn't want to go in. She didn't want to open the door. But the darkness seemed to pull her toward it, and the whispers urged her forward. "You can't escape." Emma hesitated for only a moment before her hand reached for the doorknob, the cool metal beneath her fingers sending a jolt of fear through her. The door creaked open, and a sudden wave of coldness poured out, like a gust of icy wind. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward, its red eyes glowing in the dark. It wasn't just the building anymore. It was her. She had become part of it. The figure stepped fully into view, its skeletal face distorted in a grotesque grin that sent a chill down Emma's spine. The air around it seemed to warp, the very atmosphere trembling with the weight of its presence. The whispers surged, a chorus of voices echoing in her mind as the darkness thickened, clinging to her like a suffocating shroud. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out all but the horrific realization of what she had become a part of. This wasn't just the building hunting her, it was something far worse. The very essence of the place, of the countless souls trapped here, had claimed her. The figure's eyes bored into hers, burning with an unnatural glow. Its lips moved, but instead of a voice, a series of sickening, inhuman sounds leaked from its mouth, like the rattling of bones or the scraping of nails on stone. "You are ours." Emma wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat, paralyzed by terror. She tried to back away, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the floor as though the building itself had become part of her, its malevolent energy entwined with her very being. "You can't escape." The walls seemed to stretch, the hallway distorting further as the figure advanced toward her. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. But every step she took only seemed to draw her closer to it, like a puppet caught in an inescapable web. The shadows pressed in from all sides, their cold fingers brushing against her skin, tightening around her body as if they were trying to drag her into the dark depths. "Let me in." The voice, now a guttural whisper, echoed through her mind. It was the same voice she had heard since the beginning, the one that had urged her to open the door, to walk into the abyss. It was everywhere, surrounding her, consuming her. She couldn't escape it. She tried to look away, to block it out, but the figure was closer now, only a few feet away. Its presence felt like an overwhelming weight on her chest, a suffocating force that drained the air from her lungs. The whispers reached a crescendo, each voice a knife cutting into her thoughts. And then, with a sudden, terrible clarity, she understood what it meant. It wasn't just the building. It was the curse that had bound everything together. The souls of the lost, the forgotten, the ones who had once lived here, now consumed by the building itself. Their hunger had never ceased. They had become the building, the shadows, the darkness. And now they were claiming her. The figure reached out, its bony fingers brushing against her arm, cold as death. A jolt of freezing pain shot through her body, and she gasped, unable to move. "You belong to us now." Her vision blurred, her mind spinning as the building's pulse seemed to synchronize with her own heartbeat, growing faster, more erratic. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, the walls shifting once more. But this time, it wasn't just the building warping, it was her. Her very body felt like it was unraveling, as if she was no longer in control of herself, no longer in control of anything. She could feel herself slipping away, her body becoming part of the darkness, part of the walls, part of the curse that had claimed so many before her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her hands trembling as they reached out for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. The figure leaned closer, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. And then, in a voice so quiet, so cold, it sent a shiver down her spine, it whispered one final time, "Welcome home." And in that moment, the last remnants of Emma's consciousness shattered, torn apart by the weight of the curse. The darkness swallowed her whole, the whispers drowning out all other sound, as the building claimed yet another lost soul. As the last flicker of light died, the apartment complex fell silent once more. The residents, oblivious to the horrors lurking in the dark, continued with their lives, unaware of the new addition to the building's twisted, cursed history. The power remained out, and in the heart of the high-rise, something new had awakened. The stillness that followed was not the calm after a storm, but a heavy silence, one that hung like an oppressive weight over the building, suffocating, never letting go. The darkness, once just a temporary visitor, now seemed to have settled in, a permanent tenant in every corner, every crevice of the high-rise. It thrived in the absence of light, feeding on the fear of its inhabitants, growing stronger with each passing hour, as if it were slowly claiming the very essence of the building itself. From the outside, the high-rise looked like any other, an ordinary part of the city skyline, its windows darkened and unremarkable. But inside, something had changed. It wasn't just the power outage that kept the lights from flickering back to life. It was something deeper, something more sinister, that lingered in the walls. The residents who remained in the building could feel it, though they couldn't yet name it. At first, there were just the quiet murmurs. Conversations around the building shifted, the topics no longer as light-hearted or mundane. People exchanged nervous glances, spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying just a little too much tension for comfort. The darkness in the hallways seemed to stretch longer now, and the air was colder, even during the hottest months. They began to notice things. The way the elevators would sometimes stop between floors, its doors opening into empty hallways before closing again, as though something was waiting just beyond, something that couldn't be seen but could be felt. The strange, half-heard whispers that would rise from the depths of the building, seeming to come from nowhere, but always seeming to come from everywhere. The residents of 309 were not the only ones who had experienced something. People from the upper floors, the lower floors, and even those who had just moved in all seemed to have their own strange encounters. Some claimed to hear muffled screams in the middle of the night. Others spoke of shadows flitting just out of sight, moving with unnatural speed and intent. They tried to rationalize it: power surges, poor wiring, maybe the natural creaks of an aging building. But deep down, they knew that wasn't the truth. The truth was far worse. It wasn't until a week later that anyone dared to speak of the events of that night, Emma's disappearance. It was Sarah from 307 who finally found the courage to bring it up, her voice trembling as she spoke to a small group of neighbors who had gathered in the lobby, hoping for a return of normalcy. "We haven't seen Emma for days," Sarah said quietly, glancing nervously toward the elevators as though expecting someone or something to step out. I don't know what happened, but I don't think it's a simple case of her moving out. I don't think she left. Not like that. Not in the middle of the night." The others nodded, unease settling over them like a heavy blanket. "None of us heard anything," another neighbor, Greg from 405, said. "No loud noises, no struggle, nothing. And I've been in and out of the building. She's never been gone this long. She was just here 1 minute and gone the next." There was a pause. The realization that they were speaking about something far darker than a mere disappearance hung in the air. But none of them wanted to admit it. "Not yet. I went up to her apartment," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper now, "and it's locked. But the door was open just a crack when I tried it." She shuddered, the memory of it clearly still fresh and disturbing. There was nothing inside but darkness. And it felt wrong. So wrong. The room fell silent at her words. No one spoke for a long while. That night, the whispers in the hallways grew louder. The following morning, another resident, Megan from 204, was found on the stairs, unconscious and trembling. Her eyes were wide open, yet unseeing, her body still as if frozen in place. When she finally awoke, she was barely able to speak, her voice a hollow rasp. It saw me," she muttered in delirium. It was waiting for me in the dark. Panic began to spread among the residents. Fear took root, feeding on the stories they had all shared, the sightings, the strange occurrences. And as the days passed, more people fell ill, their minds unraveling as they were haunted by what they had seen, or what they thought they had seen. Some tried to leave the building, but the elevator doors wouldn't open for them. Others ventured down the stairs only to be pulled back by invisible forces, as if the building itself were rejecting them. They were trapped, and they all knew it. By the time the police arrived, the building was on the brink of collapse, though it hadn't yet begun to show any visible signs of damage. The officers found nothing unusual on the surface, but they couldn't ignore the deep sense of dread that seemed to suffuse the air. It was as though the very foundation of the building had been corrupted, its walls closing in on the few remaining residents. It was then that the whispers became screams. Late one night, as the last of the remaining residents gathered in the lobby, the building gave a deep, guttural groan. The walls shook violently, and the lights flickered once more. But this time, there was no returning light, only darkness. The screams grew louder, echoing through the hallways, from rooms that no longer had occupants. Windows shattered, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The power was gone, and there was no escape. Outside, the rest of the city went on unaware, its lights shining brightly against the horizon. But in apartment 309, in that high-rise that had once been a normal part of the cityscape, the building was silent once more, its residents lost to the darkness, their souls absorbed into the very structure of the place, bound forever by the curse that had claimed them. The lights were out, and they would never come back on again. The building stood as it always had, silent and looming against the skyline. From the outside, there was no trace of the horrors that had unfolded within. The windows, now darkened and lifeless, gave no indication of the terror that had taken place behind those walls. People walked by it every day, oblivious to the sinister force lurking inside. Days turned into weeks, and the world outside the high-rise moved on. The police had long since abandoned their investigation, convinced it was simply a string of unfortunate incidents. But the few who remained in the area, those who had known the residents, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. They'd heard the rumors, the stories that filtered through the local grapevine. Stories of a building that seemed to have a life of its own. Stories of residents who had disappeared or were never seen again. But no one could prove it. No one could see it. And yet, the whispers hadn't stopped. At night, some of the residents who had moved into the surrounding buildings claimed to hear strange sounds emanating from the high-rise. A soft hum that vibrated through the air, like the deep rumblings of an ancient engine. And sometimes, if the wind was just right, there were whispers, faint, barely audible, carried on the breeze. They would hear it and feel a creeping unease, but they couldn't place its source. It was as if the building was still alive, still hungry for something. And then one night, someone noticed something unusual. A light flickered in one of the windows of the high-rise, the faintest glow illuminating the darkened glass. It was only for a moment, but it was enough to make someone pause. The glow didn't look like it came from the inside. It seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the building itself, like a pulse, a heartbeat. But no one dared to investigate. The building had been abandoned for so long that the authorities had removed all traces of its former tenants. The doors were locked, the elevators shut down, and the halls were silent. No one knew what had truly happened inside, not beyond the rumors and speculation. But the building had left its mark on the people who had lived nearby. They couldn't forget what they'd seen, or what they'd heard. It wasn't until a few months later that the rumors began to surface again. New residents, unfamiliar with the building's history, had started moving into the apartments. No one really knew what had drawn them there. Perhaps they were unaware of the strange occurrences that had plagued the place before. Or maybe they were desperate for a place to live, willing to overlook the rumors for the sake of convenience. But it didn't take long for them to realize that something was wrong. It started with the sounds. Soft at first, a creaking of the walls, a tapping on the windows. The kind of noises you could easily ignore or dismiss as the building's settling. But they came at odd hours, in the middle of the night when no one was awake, or at least when they thought no one was. And then there were the lights. They began to flicker again, first just one or two in random apartments, then spreading, until the entire building seemed to be plunged into a flickering chaos of light and shadow. The residents would wake up in the middle of the night, their rooms illuminated by bursts of erratic light, only for the lights to die out the moment they tried to reach the switch. Some of them tried to leave, but when they stepped outside, they found themselves trapped. The elevator would open, but it would never move, as though the building were refusing to let them go. Others found themselves locked in their own apartments, their doors no longer opening, the handles spinning endlessly in their hands. One by one, the new residents began to disappear. They never left the building, not in any way anyone could prove, and the whispers grew louder, filling the dark corners of the high-rise. It was as if the building had awoken, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to claim its next victims. And this time, there was no one left who could stop it. The building, its heart now beating once more, had found a new life. The darkness had returned. The whispers were louder now, a constant hum that filled the hallways, seeping into the walls, the floors, the very air itself. The lights would flicker, and then the building would fall silent once more, as if it were waiting, watching. There was no escape. The cursed building had claimed new souls, new bodies to twist into its monstrous form. And so the cycle continued. From the outside, the building was just another piece of the city's skyline. But inside, the horrors never stopped. The whispers never ceased. And the building waited, its hunger insatiable, its walls filled with the memories of those who had once lived there, now part of its cursed existence. There would be no end to it. Not as long as the building stood, and as long as the lights remained out, the residents of the high-rise would never know peace again. The building's grip on the high-rise was tightening, its very foundations pulsing with an unnatural energy that seemed to seep into the bones of anyone who entered. The new residents who had foolishly moved in, unaware of the building's dark past, were now mere pawns in a game that had been played for years, long before they had ever set foot inside. The night had become a blur of confusion and fear. People who had once laughed and chatted casually in the lobby now moved like shadows, their faces pale, their eyes wide and filled with dread. They no longer spoke to one another in friendly greetings or small talk. Now all they shared were whispered warnings, the sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the hallways, the quiet gasps of terror when a door would creak open by itself or a light would flicker back on in a room that had long been plunged into darkness. In the upper floors, things were worse. In apartments 1201, 1202, and 1203, the walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm, as if the building itself were breathing. Sometimes, late at night, a resident would look down the hallway to see the faintest glimmer of movement, just a figure passing in and out of sight. But when they reached the hallway, the figure was gone. No one dared to speak about what they saw, but the unease among the residents grew with each passing day. And then there was the elevator. A single elevator on the building's ground floor had started to malfunction. At first, it was just a minor inconvenience. It would stop between floors, the doors would open to reveal nothing, or the elevator would ascend or descend at odd speeds. as though some force was guiding it, pulling it up or down at its will. No matter how many times maintenance tried to fix it, the elevator would always return to its strange, unpredictable behavior. Residents who had no choice but to use it were often left feeling uneasy, as though they weren't just riding an elevator, but descending into something darker. It wasn't until a couple of days ago that someone dared to enter the building's basement. An elderly woman who lived on the 8th floor, Mrs. Wilkins, was convinced she had heard something in the darkened lower levels, a scraping sound like claws against concrete. She'd been living in the building for years, long before the strange occurrences had started, but she had never felt such a pressing need to investigate until that night. Clutching her purse tightly to her chest, she ventured down, her footsteps echoing eerily through the empty stairwell. What she found in the basement, no one could say for sure. Mrs. Wilkins never returned to her apartment. No one knew if she had made it out alive. The building's superintendent, a gruff man named Jerry, went to check the next morning, but the basement door was locked tight, the keys missing, and the elevator, though it had never gone down to the basement floor before, was now stuck at the bottom. And then the real horror began. The whispers, those soft, faint sounds that had been a background hum for so long, grew louder. They weren't just whispers anymore. They became voices, demanding, pleading, calling out for help, but twisted and warped, as though the very air itself was being torn apart. The lights began to flicker on and off more frequently, illuminating glimpses of something moving just out of sight. Some residents reported feeling cold fingers brushing against their skin. Others said they could hear the sound of something breathing in the darkness. It was no longer just a haunting, it was an infestation. There were no more quiet hours. People would scream in the night, their voices drowned out by the thudding of unseen feet running across the floors above and below them. The elevators would move on their own, its doors opening with a slow, deliberate creak, and inside, nothing but an empty, suffocating blackness. The apartments were no longer places of refuge. They were simply cages, and the building had become the predator, its walls closing in around everyone within. One by one, the residents started to vanish. At first, it was subtle, an absence at breakfast, an empty apartment in the hallway. But as the days stretched on, the disappearances became more apparent, more alarming. The management office was locked, the phone lines down, and no one could get a hold of the building's landlord. The few who tried to escape found themselves inexplicably pulled back inside, their bodies contorting with an unnatural force, as if the building itself were reaching out to pull them into its dark, suffocating embrace. And then the last of the residents, those who had somehow survived up until now, found themselves in the final stages of terror. The building had already claimed so many. The elevator doors opened again, but this time, when they entered, they weren't met with the silence they had come to dread. This time there was a sound, a low, guttural noise like the growl of some predatory beast. The doors closed behind them with a thud, and they descended not toward the ground floor, but into the depths of the building, deeper than anyone had ever gone before. When the elevator reached its destination, the doors opened to a floor that shouldn't have existed. The walls were decayed, falling apart, as though the building itself had been rotting from the inside for years. There were no lights, no windows, just endless corridors that stretched into darkness. The floor beneath their feet felt soft, damp, and spongy like wet earth. The air smelled of mold, of something long decayed and forgotten. And that's when they saw it. A figure, towering and hulking, stood in the middle of the hallway. It was covered in shadows, its shape distorted and grotesque, but its eyes, glowing, unblinking, locked onto theirs. Its form seemed to shift and change as it moved, the darkness wrapping around it like a cloak, thickening and pulling tighter with every step it took toward them. The final scream echoed through the building, but this time it was drowned by the sound of something far worse. The sound of the building, of the walls, groaning and shifting as it settled deeper into the abyss. The last light in the building went out, and the high-rise was silent once more. The building, now devoid of its inhabitants, stood tall against the horizon, but the whispers never stopped. They were there, deep in the walls, in the creaking floors, in the flickering remnants of electricity that refused to fully die. Something had been left behind, something that would wait, watching for the next unwitting soul to step through its doors. And when that happened, the cycle would begin again. The darkness never truly went out. It simply waited. The city around the high-rise continued as though nothing had ever happened, the world moving on as if the dark stories of the building were just that, stories. People walked by the structure, unaware of the lingering evil that still twisted its corridors. The faint, lingering whispers that danced on the wind seemed to escape through the cracks in the walls, but the city had no time for such rumors. But the truth was that the building was never empty, never truly abandoned. Even after the last residents disappeared without a trace, something inside the high-rise remained. The windows, now broken, stood like hollow eyes watching the world outside. The doors, though locked, creaked under the slightest breeze, as if the building itself yearned to be opened again. And in the darkness, something stirred. Months passed before anyone ventured close enough to the building again. A group of curious urban explorers, ignorant to the building's dark past, had heard the stories. They'd heard the rumors of its haunted halls and strange occurrences. But to them, it was just another place to explore, another mystery to uncover for their social media followers. They gathered in the early evening, cameras and flashlights in hand, ready to capture whatever they could find inside. They approached the building's front entrance, their footsteps slow, as if they could feel the heaviness in the air, the weight of something watching them. Despite the years of abandonment, the doors opened with ease, as if the building had been expecting them. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the stale remnants of the lives that had once filled the building. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence, each step seeming to reverberate through the empty halls. The old elevator still stood at the end of the hallway, its doors slightly ajar, but the explorers hesitated. A low hum seemed to emanate from within, as though something alive, was waiting on the other side. Ignoring their instincts, they stepped into the elevator. The air grew colder as the doors shut behind them with a resounding clunk. The elevator, which had been dormant for so long, lurched to life, its lights flickering weakly as it began its descent. The group exchanged uneasy glances as the elevator moved downward, the sounds of creaking metal and groaning machinery growing louder. Then, a strange sensation swept over them. It started as a tingling at the back of their necks, an unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. The hum from the elevator grew louder, vibrating in their bones. A low growl, almost imperceptible, seemed to vibrate in the air, as though the very building itself was exhaling. And with each passing floor they felt it, something ancient, something hungry waiting for them. The elevator stopped with a jolt, the doors sliding open. What greeted them on the other side wasn't just the basement. It was a void, an endless expanse of darkness that stretched beyond what their flashlights could reach. The air was thick with decay, an odor that made their stomachs churn. And in the distance, the faintest glow of something wrong. The group stepped out, their boots sinking into the wet, spongy floor. The walls seemed to pulse, as though alive, and the strange vibrations that filled the space grew louder with each step. The whispers, faint at first, began to emerge from the darkness. They were distorted voices, muffled, as though coming from deep within the building's core. The explorers turned their flashlights towards the noise, and that's when they saw it. A figure, its form twisted and unnatural, standing in the center of the room. Its eyes glowed, the light flickering, shifting, like the heartbeat of the building itself. Its body seemed to bend in impossible ways, its limbs stretched and contorted, as though it was more shadow than flesh. And yet, it was undeniably human in some grotesque, distorted form. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its eyes locked onto theirs. It was waiting for them to approach, to step closer. One of the explorers, a woman named Sarah, stepped forward. Something inside her urged her to take a step, to move toward the figure, and despite the terror that gripped her heart, she couldn't stop herself. It was as though the building had a hold on her, its grip tightening with each heartbeat. "No," another explorer, Mike, whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. Sarah was already too close, and in an instant the creature moved. It was a blur of motion, a flash of shadows, and then she was gone. Her scream was cut short, swallowed by the darkness as the figure dissolved back into the walls. The air went still, as if nothing had ever happened. The remaining explorers were frozen in place, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide with terror. And that's when they heard it, the sound of a door creaking open. It was followed by another, and then from all around them, the voices started. Faint at first, but growing louder, more distinct. They could hear the whispers, the cries, the tortured pleas for help. The sound seemed to come from every direction, from every corner of the room, from within the walls themselves. The building was alive. The explorers turned to run, but the darkness swallowed them whole. The walls, now writhing with shadows, seemed to close in on them, cutting off every escape route. The floor beneath their feet shifted, as though the building were shifting its shape, contorting itself into something else, something far more sinister. And as they ran through the labyrinthine corridors, their footsteps no longer their own, the whispers grew louder, clearer. It was as if the building was speaking to them, its hunger, its need for more souls, more bodies to claim. The explorers were nothing but the latest in a long line of victims, caught in the twisted cycle of the high-rise dark hunger. The last thing they heard before everything went silent was the sound of the building's elevator, its hum now replaced by a deafening roar, as if the building were pulling them into its depths, never to be seen again. Outside, the city continued to grow, oblivious to the horrors within. The high-rise stood still, silent once more. But inside, it had found its next victims, and the cycle would never end. Not until the building was empty no more.